Okay, so as he very nicely introduced me there, my name's Mark, and I work for zeebox, which is a second screen app. So today, I didn't want to do a typical sort of talk. I wrote this whole thing and I was just like, this is really boring. I've got to jazz it up, and I'm an 80s child, so I decided to do it with the theme of Thundercats for each one of the different themes that we're going to talk about. So, a little bit about me. I'm a senior front-end developer with zeebox. I've got 8 years development experience and 2 years full-time in the front end. So before this, I was actually a .NET developer. I've literally done the whole stack. I've done various different jobs, but before my last company, I started working more exclusively on the front end, and I've been fortunate that I had quite a lot of experience doing like some quite heavy JavaScript applications. So I started moving more into that domain, and zeebox approached me, and that was that. So I did a year working in zeebox London, and zeebox being a second screen app, we're basically some kind of a social aspect of television. So we're a second screen companion app for television, and we provide sort of an agnostic platform where we provide games and other such content that is synced live with the shows. So my current job now is to sort of work more on enhancements and really cool sort of games and features that go hand in hand with live shows and sort of make them more interesting. So current stack that I work with exclusively now is Node.js, which is invaluable in some cases, which I will touch on later. Obviously HTML5, JS, lots of CSS3 and animations, and the odd sprinkling in Ninjitsu, because that always works. So what are the challenges at zeebox? So as I mentioned, we work exclusively now with lots of different networks, TV networks. And so with that, obviously brings a whole other kettle of fish. But because we spread across multiple platforms, we're across Android and we're across iOS currently. We're also moving into some of the other ones as they're becoming popular. But of course, we have a web presence as well. So typically, quick turnaround. A lot of the projects I get given have to be developed and deployed quick. So we may have an idea, and then in 2 weeks I've got to deploy it live. And sometimes if it's something that runs across any one of our 3 regions, or which at the moment are London, the US, and here, we have actually deployed live stuff that I've written to all 3 regions for live events, such as the Oscars. So to give you an example of something that I've written, we should look at one such sort of widget that I wrote. So this was an Oscars game that you could sort of play along with during the show, and it would ask you a multitude of questions. So it's quite a nice little thing, and we actually came up with this concept quite quickly, and we had to deploy it very quickly as well. But not only that, it had to work just as well on web as it would in a multitude of mobile devices. So I actually have an emulator up here with the same game that you could actually play within an iPhone. So as you can see, you have to adapt to slightly different look and feel. But so we went more for a sort of simpler version with this, and it plays in much the same way. You can actually play all the questions, and at the end, you can share your scores. There's a big leaderboard. It's all good. So that's the sort of thing we build. Obviously, with that, we've got a whole multitude of devices that we have to support. So that's obviously a big challenge. With those comes a high variance in browser speed. So if you're doing something particularly ambitious, you don't want to hold yourself back because you're scared it might not work on all the devices. So we've had to adapt to that, and it's been very challenging. It's got to be fun. I mean, you can come up with a concept, you throw it out there, and it's just useless. You're just like, it's got to be engaging. So that obviously, to go with that, it's got to be fast, it's got to be performant, and it's just got to be something people want to get involved with. And finally, the latency. So sometimes that includes absorbing a multitude of services from all over the place. And I literally mean all over the place. Like when I first came to Australia, we had servers that were based on the West Coast. So obviously, West Coast of America, sorry. So obviously, ingesting multiple feeds and stuff like that, and then getting all that onto the front screen and engaging is actually quite challenging. So this talk is going to be about what I've learned in the last sort of 2 years, and I'm going to try and split that up into categories, and I'll prattle on, but I'll hopefully, if you've got any questions, then you can just sort of ask me at the end. So first of all, I'm going to talk about speed, which is probably the most important thing. But it's not necessarily speed, it's more the perception of it. So you can have the fastest app in the world. If it's on a slow phone, it's still going to be slow. So you've got to fool the person into thinking that what you're creating is fast. So obviously, happily, I've chosen Chitara for this one because she's pretty quick. So first of all, the first sort of thing that I would go over is the use of the correct events, and the main one being touch. So on touch-driven devices, obviously you assign a click event. But if you put a click event on a touch-driven device, in some cases there's a 300 millisecond gap between that event propagating to the click. And not only that, the click shows a horrible little square. It's really nasty. So one of the key things that I'd recommend doing is making sure that you account for the different types of events for the different types of devices. There's a lot of things people don't think about, but believe me, it makes a really big difference. Second, require.js. Now, I do have a little bit of engineering talk in this, but require.js for me, it all boils down to the speed. Because ultimately, you all know, if you have scripts on the top of your markup, it's going to block, the rendering part of your code. So you're actually not going to see what it is you're trying to show the user. And believe me, when it's a social app like mine, they're so fickle, they'll give it you've got maybe 5 seconds tops on most mobile devices before you're able to turn it off. So it's got to be super quick. And one of the things I leverage for that is require. Because with require comes RGS. And RGS means that I can build and concatenate everything into one file, including some images, and I can stick a humongous cache server on it and put it on a CDN. Happy days. You've got fast delivery of your logic. Don't use JS for everything. Just don't. A lot of people tend to think, I came personally from the whole sort of back end, and then I came to the front. I was much more comfortable doing JavaScript, you know what I mean? But really, especially now, CSS3 offers so many more benefits over the look and feel and what it is you're trying to provide the user. And my computer just turned off. Excuse me, 1 second. Okay, so I was actually in a meetup with Nicholas Zarkis, who's one of the guys from Yahoo, and he told me, this is invaluable, do as much as you can with HTML and CSS as possible, and then use JavaScript. And that absolutely sings true. I try and do as much as I possibly can before I even touch the JavaScript. In fact, all my JavaScript actually does is do a little bit of prattling about with figures, and then adds and removes classes. That is it. So offloading animations. So touching on why I use CSS3 is because CSS3 has the ability to offload a lot of the animations directly onto the GPU. So what you're going to get is you can have a really cool animation that might be integral to what it is you're trying to do, but it'll get jank on the slower devices. And believe me, you're developing Chrome or something like that on your lovely fast Mac, and it looks great. But then you put it on a slower device, particularly some Android ones, and it just looks rubbish. But a nice little trick is that there is the opportunity to, if it's available, to leverage that animation and push it straight onto the GPU. And you can do that with a number of, this is just one way that you can do it, is by folding it into thinking. You're performing a 3D transition, in which case it moves it directly onto the GPU. And believe me, this can make a really big difference in how your app actually looks on phones. 5, images. Strip them, get them as small as possible, and use as few as you can. And what I mean by that is, we have a CDN for all our images that we serve, and we've got big caches on it. It's served out of a CDN in Sydney. Use of SVGs. If you use an SVG for a lot of your iconography, you can put that in your templates, RGS it, the whole thing, zip it all up together. It's a real lifesaver, in terms of some things. But not only that, obviously there's sprites. Again, I will try with this SVG. If I can't use that, I'll move on to a sprite. I'm like a Nazi when it comes to images. I'm literally like a Nazi when it comes to images. So let's talk about engineering. Frameworks. Only use what is required. Again, on mobile devices, you've got to think about the bandwidth. You've got to think about what it is you're downloading. So only use the minimum that you need to use to get the product out the door. So when it comes to websites and doing responsive websites, that's great. But when you work on a mobile, you've got to remember that costs something. And unless you're vigilant, you'll pay for it. So the first thing I do when I'm scoping it is that I will use the bare bones system of what it is I need to use. And then if I have to, to get what I need, I will do that. I will use employer framework. Backbone's one that I use quite a lot. I've used AngularJS. It really just depends. What's more important is how you design what it is you're trying to do and splitting things up logically. Grunt. Does anybody here use Grunt? Yeah. Grunt is absolutely brilliant for this sort of thing. If you're trying to tie together all these brand new features, Grunt saves your life. It performs a really great build process for you while you're working with less or SAS or anything like that. It helps you while you're working. It's an absolutely invaluable tool. And if you're not using it, I very, very much recommend that you do. And then, as I mentioned before, less and SAS. They're both absolutely invaluable to me right now. I mean, I would never drop those. I would maybe drop some of the JavaScript frameworks, but I'd certainly never drop those because they just allow you to structure your CSS and reuse it, make it dry, modular, and easy to read. So these two are fairly sort of typical. Use of a decent web proxy. I use Charles because I'm a Mac man. And it's invaluable when you're debugging phones and other things like that. Being able to use that and use some of the proxy mapping and stuff like that enables me to test things that I wouldn't necessarily need to test. And believe me, when you're trying to work with a lot of devices, particularly mobile, you're going to need every spanner in the toolkit, shall we say. And this can really help you out in some cases. And Chrome Devtools, but that goes without saying, really. I use it all the time, specifically some of the more advanced techniques, looking for jank, pate events, debug, and in some cases, memory leaks. So, third case is stealth, but it's not. I was trying to think of how to fit in Tigra, and I was like, what does he do? And he's pretty sneaky. So it's stealth, but it's basically what can we do that's a bit sneaky. So what other things can we do that are a bit creative that can help us get around these sorts of things? So if you're doing something particularly heavy inside of a game or anything you've created, you can offset that to your server, and that's what we've started to do with a lot of things. We're getting more and more. We've got a game studio now. We're getting more and more experimental. You've got to offload some of that and bite the bullet and offload it onto your Node.js server to process it and cache it, and that can really save you a lot of time. And so it's not something you always think about, but I would definitely recommend doing so. Steal or borrow. I am a purist. I think I know better than everybody, and I will try and write. I will literally look out and say, I can do that, and I'll try and write it myself. And the amount of time I've wasted doing that, when there's a perfectly good framework out there that can do it for you. And if you don't need the whole framework, you can always pick it apart. We've all got GitHub. It's an open source world. Just steal the bits that you need and use them. Feature detection. Again, very important. Use of modernizer. When you're working, because I work with so many different devices, some cases I come across some issues. And the best, it's not, you can't just isolate to that one thing, that one device, because that's cheating. You've got to use modernizer in a better way, being able to progressively enhance things. So, for example, we support IE9. I can't get all the stuff that I want to do out of IE9, but I can establish a base sort of enhancement, a base sort of way that they'd use it, and then I can build on that for the newer devices. So all this stuff really, it can be a bit overwhelming, and it does feel a little bit like the Wild West at the moment. But it's an area that's growing so quickly, and it's an area that I would recommend delving into as soon as you can. The latest iOS devices, they've got 64-bit chips on them. It's really opening the doors to what we can do. And I would also recommend as well, taking that mobile-first approach. I find that to be the easiest way for iWork now. So I adapt to mobile first, get in there, really see what we can do, and all the experience I've gathered, it really has made a big difference. So adapt to mobile first, go for it, make mistakes, but stick in there, and eventually, because it's only ever going to get better. It is the fastest growing area in development, and it will continue to improve. So with all those things together, it kind of makes you feel a little bit like Lino.